All right. So, welcome. This is episode 3 of the Aquarium Insider Podcast with me. My name's Dan Connor. And today, super stoked. We got Ryan from Wild Fish Tanks on the cast talking about Bristlenose Plecos today. So I'm stoked to talk about that. Ryan, thank you so much. Definitely agree. Definitely super excited for you to come on the podcast. We met, I guess we talked about earlier, maybe like a year and a half ago. You were the first person to come to our farm and see some stuff. So it was I almost feel like that was my first start of like, this is something I need to look into, like, and break into like this sort of realm. And it's been like a snowball ever since, it feels like. So I credit you for a lot of that, because I was like, I didn't even know this existed a lot of the time. So
that's funny, man. Yeah, it's been a bit. It's been good to see you and see you grow. Like we were talking the last time I was at your shop, you guys had just begun the process of putting the tanks in there. You weren't even really full with water, and I've got a chance to kind of talk to you here and there over the last year and a half. Got to catch up last weekend at Aquashella, which was nice, and I really appreciate you inviting me and being here to talk about some Bristlenose Plecos, man.
Yeah, man. Super excited about that. So let's kind of dive in. And before we real dive in, I wanted, if you could just give a quick background to some of the new listeners, new viewers, and a little bit about yourself. And then also I'll have Ryan's information in the show notes. So if you want to find him on Instagram and YouTube, I'll have all those links there for you.
Yeah. So I run a fish room in my garage with about 87 tanks, and I focus on a few different types of fish. Some guppies. I do some smaller dwarf cichlids, but I really do focus on a lot of Bristlenose Plecos. I happen to breed them and work with a few different color variations. But in today's podcast, I really just want to talk about kind of the basic care requirements, what you really need just to kind of keep them happy and healthy. In my opinion, they're an awesome fish for someone just getting into the hobby or has been in the hobby for a long time. But really excited to talk Bristlenose Plecos, because when I kind of got into the hobby as an adult a couple years ago, they were one of the first fish I kept, and I enjoy them just as much, if not more, keeping them today. Awesome.
That's great. All right, so I kind of wanted to I want to give you a little general of a question first, because I skewed a lot of the podcast to kind of help newer aquarists, and this one's a little bit more general, and then we'll kind of get more specific as the podcast goes on. So the first question is just like, for the newer aquarist out there, what would be just one piece of advice you would help them, generally speaking, as far as like, what do you think would be most helpful for them sort of moving forward on this Aquarius journey?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think in general, the biggest thing that helped me out was not only YouTube and finding fish friends and bouncing things off of, but my own trial and error. So it's kind of a combination of, there's a lot of good information out there, but you have to kind of treat this hobby with some patience and take this time. So I think my biggest thing is, when you get into this hobby, look at it as a long haul. Don't look at it as a quick thing. There's going to be a lot of trial and error, but there's a lot of different resources. If you're listening to this podcast, then obviously you're already on the right track. But definitely look at it as a long haul, and look that you can explore and trial and error over many years. There's a lot of different kind of nooks and crannies of this hobby. So I would say take your time. Take your time. There's a lot of things you can do, and you have plenty of time to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's good advice. I think it's a lot of people, I think, maybe starting might think this is super, super easy, super quick. I'll just put a bunch of stuff up and it's instantly going to be amazing, and it's going to stay that way. And I just feel like that there's going to be a lot of issues with that. But I think definitely time is a good way to approach it, for sure. All right, so let's dive into Bristlenose. So, kind of started off, when did you start keeping Bristlenose? I know you mentioned a few years ago, but when did you start keeping them, I guess?
Yeah, so I kept fish as a kid, but never kept any Bristlenose Plecos. The Plecos I kept as a kid were what are referred to as the common Plecos. You find them in a lot of the stores, even to this day, and they may be only a couple inches when you get them, but they grow to be massive, massive beasts, literally like 2 feet plus. I know you know this already, Dan. So when I got back into the hobby, it was 2016. Around 2016, I got a tank off Craigslist, and it was kind of a community tank. It had an angelfish and some tetras and stuff like that. Didn't have any plecos, and my long-term goal was some dwarf cichlids, what have you. But I did a little bit of research, and I learned that this thing called the bushy nose or the bristlenose pleco was probably going to be a better bet for me than what I used to keep as a kid than a common pleco. First and foremost, just because of its size, because it only maxed out at about 5 or 6 inches, and its requirements as far as a tank were not nearly as much long term.
Awesome. All right. I should have asked this question first, but I'm going to ask it now.
Yeah.
And I know because you've already said it, it's Pleco. I want to say for the majority of my life, I probably called it Pleco.
Pleco. And
I don't know.
think you're wrong, though. I think it's like the whole beta, man. I don't know.
Yes.
Excuse me.
I don't know. In my head, I remember hearing it. Oh, the wild collectors are bringing Pleco eggs. And I just remember hearing it as Pleco my entire life growing up. And I'm just like.
And I feel like your experience may hold a little more weight. I'm not sure if the listeners, if you're an avid listener, Dan, you probably know that he grew up, in a fish farm life. So when Dan says he heard it growing up, he means he heard it from like the people collecting them and in the industry big term. And to be honest, when I've heard it called a Pleco, it's mostly been from people in the industry, like all the not all, but I'd say the vast majority of the farmers and stuff. I hear them refer to it as a Pleco instead of a Pleco. But for whatever reason, I'm a Pleco guy, and I say biker also. I don't know if you're a biker guy or but I say I don't say bisher, but I say biker.
I want to say I called it a biker. I'll be honest. I think it was a biker because we have some in right now, some Delhaizees. So I just had to ask that because I didn't know anything. And because Jay goes, "You mean Pleco?" He goes, "Who calls it Pleco?" I'm like, I've been calling it that my whole life. So it's like, I guess I got to rethink some things. So I just had to mention that because I was thinking about that as you were talking.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So, So what? I guess the size. So is size what really made you want to start keeping them because you thought that would be a better fit for your aquariums at the time?
Yeah.
Was that the thought process?
A couple things. Yeah. Number one, the size. Number two, I had read that most people get into these sucker mouth catfish because they're looking to something to clean the algae. It's very common that I have algae in my tank. How do I get rid of it? And in my opinion, there's a lot better ways than buying a fish to control it. But the Bristlenose Pleco will eat algae, and typically they do a better job at it than a common Pleco, and they'll munch on some algae throughout their lifespan, and they won't kind of get bored of it after a couple of years like the common Plecos seem to. So I think those two things were definitely what led me to the bushy nose pleco or bristlenose pleco.
I have a few questions coming up as I think about them. Do you think they're as messy as regular plecos?
Yeah, I think they're pretty messy. They poop a lot, especially I can't say that I've compared them to a lot of like common plecos lately, but compared to other fish, like pound for pound for a fish, 100%. Like compared to a guppy or other things, when I'm moving fish around, having a little container, like a little tiny 1-inch pleco will poop so much in a little deli cup in just like 30 minutes or an hour. It's crazy. I don't know where it all comes from.
Yeah, we so on the farm here, we started breeding the albino bristlenose here like a year ago, I guess now. And my God, they're so messy. They're so messy. I'm like, my God, this is a lot. I better start siphoning a lot more, I guess, because this is not doing enough. There's a lot of waste in the bottom of this tank. So I can't imagine how much ammonia they're putting off if they're putting that much kind of waste out, I guess. So I just wanted to mention that because I was like, man, that's something to think about. All right.
Yeah, no, I agree. They can be a messy fish. That's why, once again, buying a fish for a problem is not necessarily my best advice always. And that can be a lot of things. People say, oh, I have snails. Oh, buy a clown loach. And it's a little more complicated than that, in my opinion. It's like, I have algae, buy a bristlenose. That's not a bad idea, but it's a little more complicated than that. Like I said, a bristlenose pleco is a good algae eater. Actually, it's good to have it in there. But like I said, there's other things to do to control that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I guess just a little bit of experience I've had with them a little bit. They seem, I don't know, for me, they seem a little, I like them a lot for a lot of the algae. Same reason you kind of addressed, like algae is definitely a big thing in the store. the biggest difference we see is a lot of price point difference between that and a normal common Pleco, because they are more expensive a lot of times. I'm like, well, that's why, going back to your time and your, sort of the research side of things, like, hey, research, how long do you want to keep this thing in the same size aquarium you're going to put them in? If you're going to do that, this is your better option for long-term care, or you're going to end up with some other things that might not be as good. Some other, everything has a consequence at some level. So that might be something to consider if they're depending on what kind of algae to put in there. But definitely, I like the bristlenose because it's a good in between fish for me. Like, it's not a super small, algae eater. It's definitely a little bit bigger. It can definitely take down some algae for sure. So yeah. I like that. I like that fish for that reason, for sure.
And that's a great point that you make about the price point, because let's be honest, like, I'm there a lot of times. I know people listening, they're there. Like, that's a huge factor in what we're going to keep. I mean, that's just a fact. And I know that, I think luckily Bristlenose Plecos are at a lot of local fish stores. Like, I mean, I think probably, I would venture to guess that almost every single local fish store has Bristlenose Plecos, and I'd say more than half of, just big box stores, a lot of them will carry the Bristlenose Plecos as well. Like, unfortunately, like you said, when you walk in, you'll see the common Plecos already bigger than the Bristlenose Pleco, and it's usually cheaper. So it's kind of like, okay, this is a smaller fish and it's more expensive. It's hard to, go towards that fish, understandably so. But I would bring it back to, like, my piece of advice in terms of, patience in the long haul. And I would just say that Bristlenose Pleco in most cases is going to be a better investment and just do much better for you long term, whether you have a 20-gallon tank or a 55 or even a bigger tank. A Bristlenose Pleco is going to fit the bill for many different scenarios.
Yeah, 100%. It's very universal in a lot of settings for a lot of different types of setups, which I guess we'll talk about here in just a few. I did want to mention before that part, though, do you think there are any specific unique requirements they need? Like, as far as, like, water requirements or anything special you see that is a little different than other, I guess, algae eaters in that case?
Yeah, I think that's actually another one of the reasons why I keep that fish and pretty much all the fish. One other piece of advice I would give to beginner aquarists, as well as just any aquarist, to make it easier on you, would be keep the fish that's kind of in your water, or what's good for your water. So if you have a certain type of water, you can try to manipulate it and make it better for something you want to keep. But in my opinion is try to find some fish that already work well with that water. And the good thing about a Bristlenose Pleco is it's pretty dang flexible. It's not too picky when it comes to temperature requirements, pH requirements. They probably like a little bit like moderate to moderately hard water. They'll do okay in super or in softer water. They come from the Amazon. I keep mine, like I said, in my garage fish room, and the temperature goes from the low 60s all the way up into the mid 80s, and they do okay. I would recommend, keeping them in the mid to high 70s, and they'd be perfect. But I just say that to state that they're pretty universally adaptable. People keep them in some cichlid tanks and much harder water. I have them in planted tanks with Indian almond leaves, which will go ahead and lower the pH and make it a little softer. And they seem to do well in all those scenarios.
Yeah, and I think that's super important, especially when you're first getting in. You're trying to figure out what to put up. You're like, my God, I gotta get something that cleans the bottom. What do I get? Where do I go? And you find something like one that's not going to outgrow if you get a smaller tank, a 30-gallon or whatever size you're going to put it in, right? And then on top of that, like, it can adapt to a lot of different, and I see the same thing here. So it adapts to a lot of different water qualities. We don't lower the pH of it a lot for our fish. They're all relatively harder water, higher pH type fish, mostly 7. I think our pH is like 7.6 and above, mostly. So it's one of the most versatile fish we have here on the farm, and then also in our, our tanks in the store there too. So what was I going to try to say? It's a good fish to start with if you're looking for algae eaters, for sure.
Yeah, and it doesn't really, the cool thing about it is it doesn't really kind of handicap you too much Whereas if you start adding fish, like I mentioned kind of earlier, adding a clown loach for snail control, well, I mean, that's going to the clown loach is a great fish, don't get me wrong, but it has high heat requirements. It's really going to kind of potentially pigeonhole you into what else you can keep. Whereas a bristlenose added to a tank really kind of keeps the options open. I did want to say that there's nothing that I think is specifically required for them, but they do love driftwood. And I do keep driftwood in with every single one of my Bristlenose Pleco tanks. Like I said, they're not going to, perish on you without driftwood, but they do appreciate a nice piece of something like a Malaysian driftwood, something that kind of is a little softer. They can really kind of gnaw on or eat the algae off of. Not that they can't like spiderwood, but spiderwood's a little kind of like more like it's more harder. They really appreciate something like a little flatter surface and something they can really kind of, like I said, graze on. But not a requirement, but definitely I think it'll go a long way in helping you keep them happy.
Yeah, definitely. Real quick, for your tanks, for the bristlenose, what kind of tanks, I'm trying to think of a good word to put it. What kind of tanks would you see bristlenose, I guess, doing well in? Do you think they do well in planted tanks? Are they gonna munch on the plants or something? They're gonna wreck the substrate? Like what do you see as being a good tank setup, I guess, for the bristlenose? I guess you mentioned it, like obviously driftwood helps, right?
Yeah.
But putting them in more community driven tank, like community fish driven tank, what do you think?
100%. So I think that like I said, the good news about the Bristlenose Pleco is it's not going to be aggressive too much. Now you can run into, if you have, let's say, 2 large males in a smaller tank, I'd say I'm calling it like a 20-gallon or lower. The 2 males could get territorial, and in their territorial beef, so to speak, they could mess up, some plants. So I would say I wouldn't worry about Bristlenose Plecos attacking or going after any fish. I wouldn't worry about them being too aggressive with each other unless you have 2 males in a smaller-ish tank. But if anything, they've been known to kind of attach themselves to sword plants. And like I said, they can get rambunctious. If you get a male that gets rambunctious, he can potentially disturb a nicely manicured aquascape. So if you're really going for that like dialed-in aquascape stuff, then I'd probably forego the Bristlenose Pleco because they can mess it up a little bit. But in terms of like a planted tank, just like if you want to keep just a nice planted tank, I don't think a Bristlenose Pleco will do too much damage. Like I said, maybe keep an eye on your sword plants, but besides that, I say go for it. Awesome.
Oh, and this was the most, I guess this is, I wanted to kind of dial back in from earlier. I was like, I asked you for like a general tip for like, if someone was going to keep Bristlenose Plecos in their aquarium, what's like the biggest thing they should take away from this and say, this is what you should have, this is what you should do, like above all, I guess, is a good, I know it doesn't be the end all be all, but what's something people should know?
Yeah. I mean, the good news is, like I said, they're pretty hardy. There's no real special trick. I would say the biggest thing, and this goes for most fish, but these guys, they don't require crazy diet or anything. But I would say you really want to stay on top of water changes with them since they are dirty. If you're going to be keeping them with other fish, probably not just by themselves. They do have a decent sized bioload. So you want to stay on top of your water changes, and it'll help them grow. Bristlenose Plecos are not, I wouldn't say they're like super, super slow growers. Like you're not going to have to wait years and years. But it's not like a guppy or some of these other fish where it's full grown in 6 months.
Right.
You're gonna probably, in my opinion, it's a cool thing. It's part of that whole process and enjoying it. You're going to be able to watch this fish grow for at least a year or two before it really starts to kind of take its final form and fill out and kind of, if it's a male, get those kind of cool bushy bristles. And I think staying on top of your water changes is going to really help that process. And like I said, expedite it. It's not a magic trick, but it's gonna help that fish kind of really just stay happy and healthy because, like we were talking about earlier, they can be messy. So,
yeah, definitely. All right, let's get into a little bit more specific questions. I guess I would call this segment, I call it YAQA. I haven't come up with a better name, but it stands for Your Aquarium Questions Answered. And these are some more of the common questions a lot of people are asking about the Bristlenose Plecos. They're a little shorter answers for the most part, but they're somewhat more specific. So I guess I'll start with that one. So obviously this is probably the most common question is what size tank do you think is a minimum for the Bristlenose?
Yeah, I would say that if you're planning on keeping one with a bunch of other community fish, and it's just going to be kind of like your main bottom inhabitant, essentially, I'd say you could probably get away with a 20 long. I like a 29. I started out with kind of 2 and a 29. If you get 2 males in a 29, you're probably going to have some squabbling. But I think 1 in a 20 or 29. If you want 2, I'd say to be safe, 55 gallon is 40 breeder, 55 gallon. You get 2, they'll grow out. It's nice. And that's with, now you can have your whole other community with those fish as well.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next one real quick. What do you feed them? What's a good food for that fish?
Yeah, so they are a bottom dweller. So some of the most common foods I feed them are going to be some sinking pellets and sinking wafers. They're kind of omnivores, so it could be a little bit of meat, a little bit of vegetable matter is all good for them. One of the funniest things when people who aren't fish keepers, they think it's funny because you can feed them green beans. Actually, not just green beans. My go-to is like canned green beans. I get the French cut ones because they're already kind of sliced up. I get no salt added. I don't think it matters, to be honest. A little bit of salt's not going to harm your fish. But I get the no salt added French cut green beans, and I'd say just start slow at first. But usually most Bristlenose Plecos will take to those. They'll take to zucchini or a lot of other vegetables you can try. You can Google and look it up. But that's usually just kind of a treat or something. The main staple is going to be get a nice pellet or a wafer. Or people forget that even flake food, if you put it in there and kind of stir up and it'll sink, and they'll eat it if it falls. I'd say that a really special treat would be rapashi, and that's like kind of a gel food. It's a powder food you make, and it's the cool thing about that is it's water soluble, so it's not going to, or water stable, I guess. I don't know, but you can leave it in the water for a while. It's not going to spoil the tank. But I would say that's definitely not required. But if you're looking to go the extra mile, look into rapashi powdered food.
Yeah, the rapashi food, I used it. I used to have it with goldfish, and I was making it for a lot of the goldfish, and that was probably one of the best foods I ever fed for that. And I was like, man, this is pretty legit. Wasn't that difficult to make? I didn't think. But definitely it is an extra mile food as far as like you're putting, you're boiling water, you're mixing it in a thing, you're letting it set, and cool down and whatnot and cutting little squares.
But it doesn't smell, it doesn't smell as good though.
Oh, it does not smell very good. It definitely does not. It's boiled, fish food, and you got to do it outside. I couldn't do it in the house. All right. I wanted to actually ask you one piggybacking question on this, because this is actually asked a lot. I found out is, because you've seen you're breeding them obviously, so you can kind of see rate of growth and stuff. Do you think if you feed the fish a different, like one of those foods, do you think they go faster on anything specific that you've seen, or is it just as long as they're eating, a time, 2 times a day, whatever you want to feed them? Is that basically the better advice, I guess? Yeah.
So I feel as if your goal is to keep a happy, healthy Pleco, then you feed the fish a couple times a day. It's pretty easy to take care of. You shouldn't go wrong. But yeah, for my strategy, if I'm really trying to maximize them, I breed them to grow them out. I found that water changes beyond anything. Now, a continuous source of food, I don't know that one food's better than the other. The one good thing about the rapashi is you could put a ton in. I don't do this all the time; it'd be really expensive. But you could just literally throw a ton of rapashi. And that way, 24/7, they have something to graze on. Like, you don't have to worry about it spoiling. You just overfeed the crap out of the crud out of the tank, and just let them go to town continuously. But like I said, I think in terms of really growing them quickly, water changes has been by far, I think, the biggest thing that I've seen is makes a difference.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. So I'll throw a little commentary, I guess, on that. Is I don't see, here we feed them. We fed a few different diets to them and whatnot, and I haven't seen any difference in growth. It was almost the amount of times we fed them changed it. Water temperature really didn't help a lot. our water temp. Our water temperature is roughly the same in our tanks year round for all those fish, 75 to 77 roughly. I was thinking maybe that would help, speed up metabolism, feed a few fish, but that didn't seem to matter as much as just how often we fed and how much they ate, I guess. And not every fish grows the same. It's all, some grow a little faster, some grow a little slower. It's all kind of, fish dependent on a lot of it, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of genetics in there. I think because we have to remember, like, when these Bristlenose Plecos have these babies, there's the genetics from these two parents, and that gets spread over, 100 babies. So we see a decent array of genetics displayed, as opposed to like humans. Maybe a couple has 2, 3, 4 babies. The genetics aren't as widely displayed. So I don't know if that's why, but in fish, you just get runts kind of every once in a while.
Yep, absolutely. All right. The next one is, and this is a pretty common one, is when do you start seeing the plecos get their bristles? When do they get the bristles start growing?
So yeah, it's a big common question, because kind of like in guppies, when they see the color, like as soon as you start seeing a little bit of color on a guppy, it's like it's probably a male, because usually the females don't get as much color or any color at all. Same thing in a Bristlenose Pleco. The females don't usually get bristles at all. I've heard stories of some females getting a little bit of bristles, but I have yet to see it personally. Not that I've seen a million Bristlenose Plecos, but I've noticed usually around 2 inches, and that could be somewhere around 6 to 9 months, you're going to start seeing the Bristlenose Plecos develop. The males will start to develop those appendages, those bushy appendages around their mouth. And then as they get older, after a year or two, they start to get more and more of them, and they split into, I don't know what the technical term is, but they split off. You know what I'm talking about. They split off into like different ones, and they kind of get these cool little spider web effects. But I'd say that at least 6 months, if not to 9 months, and usually it's that 9 month to 12 month mark where I'll start seeing some breeding behavior as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got quite a few going at the moment as far as on the breeding side, and I definitely agree. I don't I'm not sexting them 24/7. I mean, I'm looking at them here and there. We have a guy that does a lot of our breeding here for us, and I was looking at him, I don't know, maybe like a couple weeks ago, and I mean, it looked like we had a female that it was so small it was almost unrecognizable. Like, I don't think I would call that a bristle. It just didn't look developed, I guess is a good way to put it. But even some of the males we've saw, like some had great bristles coming in, some had very few in that range, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, all that range. It's all growing at a different rate genetically, right? That's a big thing.
Yeah.
So, it's just something to think about. If your bristle nose isn't getting all of the bristles up front, just don't stress out too much. Give it a little time. It might still be young. I bet if you're buying this at a pet store and most of them are probably around 2 inches, they're just now gaining those bristles.
I would honestly, like I said, I don't see a lot. I would honestly say that you're probably buying a fish that's closer to an inch and a half at a pet store. So yeah, you're probably a couple months away from bristles. And keep in mind that the fish, it's interesting. People don't realize this, and I still have my hard time wrapping around it. Like a fish that's like a 1 1/4 inches, when it goes from a 1 1/4 to 1 3/4, like that half inch is like a big growth, because it puts on a lot of like size in terms of like width to it too. Like when you see it, like those couple months, like it's like, oh, it's only grown a half an inch, maybe a half an inch in length, but it looks like a totally different fish in terms of thickness too. So a lot of times you'll buy those fish kind of right before they're looking to put on that little bit of a growth spurt. And it's usually kind of at the end of that growth spurt, they've gotten that thickness, and then they start to develop those bristles when they're males. But yeah, it's cool. And like you said, it's never the same. You can never like calculate it exactly. That's for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I don't know the best way to describe this, almost like a ramping period for different species. It takes them a while to get from like stage 1 to the next part, and then they just take off for a while. And then after that, like big growth spurts happen, they might taper off a little bit. It's in different species. It's not always the same, but I feel like it could be that way in Bristlenoses. They grow slow at first, and they hit this mark, and it's just they're off to the races for a little bit. They're getting bigger, faster, quicker. They're getting wider, like you were saying, and they kind of taper off again. I don't know. It's just something I've seen here, putting through a few different species like that. It just kind of made sense. So.
Yep. No, it's interesting, and I'm sure you've been around a lot of breeders. Whenever I hear these guys that have been in the industry and fish farms or just private home breeders, and people ask them all the time, like, how do you sex a fish or what? Like, the most common thing I hear is, you think they'd have all these technical things and all this. You go, no, they let them sex themselves. Like, you put them in a tank together, and then you watch them, and they'll tell you what's the male and the female. You kind of watch them do their thing. The male will eventually grow bristles. The female will, get a little gravid. In angelfish, whatever you name the species, and you kind of just have some patience, and they'll reveal it to you. They'll let you know eventually.
Yeah. And maybe that's something maybe a lot of people don't know is, from the scale perspective of breeding these fish or any other fish, as much as I hate to say it, it's not really that scientific. We're not going out there with billboards and tracking and logging every ounce of data. We're making sure we're keeping how they're being sexed, right? Roughly. I mean, they might be tracking month. They might be tracking the genetic. They might be tracking the genetics. Actually, that would make the most sense. They might be tracking genetics depending on the fish, and then from there, it's just what worked, what didn't work, and then don't repeat what didn't work, and then try to find another pair of fish, another way to do this. Maybe it's feed, whatever it is. Temperature. They could be. Most people are probably just manipulating temperature in food, where some others might get a little bit more advanced and start manipulating. For these fish, I wouldn't say it, but other fish I've seen them manipulate photo period for like some really high-end fish, but that's not for these fish. So Don't want to get too confusing for this, but that's typically the couple things they'll deal with.
That makes sense. I've heard that too. Like you said, temperature and then kind of like conditioning with food are the two things, like you said, that I usually hear people manipulate.
Yep. All right. One of the last questions is, and I wanted to dive a little bit more into this. I know we briefly talked about it, but what tank mates do you think go well with the bristlenose? If someone's putting up a tank, and I don't know how we want to break that down as far as a community tank, or just name off some species. Either or is good. Yeah,
exactly. Because there's a lot of different options out there, but I'll definitely name off a few of my favorites. I apologize. I don't know if we mentioned it yet. I'm on my phone. I'm sitting in front of my computer, so we tried to do the stream from my computer, and for some reason, my 2-year-old iPhone has a much better connection than my hardwired laptop. That's why I'm kind of jerking around here a little bit, and it just started pouring here. So if you hear a little, rain, I apologize. But some of my favorite bristlenose setups, I think the tried and true, and this is kind of like the quote unquote breeding for profit. And I know this is more of a beginner thing. We don't really get into breeding, but they're all beginner fish. And that is Bristlenose Plecos with guppies and cherry shrimp. So it's a tank that 3 species that are not that hard to breed. They all have pretty easy care requirements. They don't usually predate on each other. The guppies will make more. The shrimp will make more. The plecos will make more. If you're not looking to breed, or you don't have an outlet, don't put a pair of plecos in there, or maybe just keep some male guppies or something like that. But that's definitely a good one if you are looking to breed. But I think Bristlenose Plecos on the bottom would go great with, if you want to start with a smaller tank, let's say a 20-gallon, just some tetras. You pick any of those kind of like small to mid-sized tetras, and you put the Bristlenose at the bottom. I think that's a perfect setup. If you want to go to like a 55-gallon, one of my favorites, like a planted rainbow tank. You get some rainbow fish.
Oh.
They're nice and peaceful. They're going to be darting around and flashy. Yeah, man. I just think they just kind of need that. I'd say a 55-gallon would probably be better than a 40 breeder for those bigger rainbow fish, because they like to dart back and forth. But yeah, like a planted setup with some rainbow fish, and then you just get a Bristlenose Pleco or 2 for the bottom of your 55 or something. That's a really nice kind of a planted setup, in my opinion. I'll throw one more out. This is kind of the top of my head. I'll throw one more out there. This is just kind of like a South American. If you wanted to kind of go like South American stuff, since the Bristlenose Pleco is from South America. Oh gosh, no, I can't. Like the Buenos Aires tetra, like a Buenos Aires tetra.
Oh yeah.
Those are kind of a not super rare tetra, but those are a little bigger, beefier tetra. Probably like a 40 breeder or something. Get a nice school of those guys. They shouldn't bother your Bristlenose Pleco. And keep in mind that if you're keeping one Bristlenose Pleco in like a 40 breeder or a 55, go ahead and throw a school of Corys in there. You want to get like 6 or 8 Corys of something along with your Bristlenose Pleco. I know they're both bottom feeders, but one Bristlenose Pleco and a 55, I think there's still room for a little herd of Corys as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that actually brought up something I wanted to talk about and why I like that tank set. So your first tank set, you mentioned the Plecos, the cherry shrimp, and the guppies. I like that for a couple things. One, a lot of people do want to add more than one bottom feeder to their tank because they're like, "Well, I really like that. Ooh, that's got nice color," and they want to throw something else in there. So throwing in something like a cherry shrimp, I think, is a cool addition because it gives them something that maybe has a little bit more color pop to add to their sort of like bottom of the tank. And then I know you mentioned Corys as well. Look, my wife's favorite fish is pretty much a Corridors, any Corridors cat. She loves pandas, stir-bys. I'm actually trying to find some different Corys at the moment to put in her other tanks and whatnot. But yeah, I like the idea of keeping more than one bottom feeder. And as long as they're not, predating on anything or trying to outcompete, and I think those fish match well with Bristlenose. And we've kept them over the years. I've never had any issues with them, chomping on anything or attacking or none of that stuff. I mean, it's just not something you see. So I think people who don't know, like, well, I don't know, it's a good thing to say you can put a different type of bottom feeder and here's a couple that work for you. Right. And then obviously keeping fish in different parts of the water column, right? Stuff that might swim in the middle, getting some different types of tetras. Like I've been really big into the Orange Flame Vonario tetras lately. Yes. Those were some different ones. I haven't seen them a lot often, and they're being bred commercially, and those are pretty cool. They swim roughly in the middle-ish of the tank. They're nice, and then just keeping that striated pattern, so you've always got something going on in the tank, I think is a good way for a new Aquarius to kind of approach fish keeping, right? And I think that kind of stops maybe some of the competition, I guess, if there was going to be some competition, quote unquote. I don't know. Keep it simple, I guess, is the easy way to put it.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a lot of good options. Like I said, the Bristlenose Pleco, since it is peaceful itself, the only thing you have to worry about is fish getting after it. And there's plenty of fish to select from that won't get after it because, it's going to keep to its bottom. It's going to keep down there. So, unless you get some kind of aggressive cichlid. And to be honest, it's a fish that I haven't kept a lot with a lot of cichlids. But it's a fish that they say if you're going to try, not that it's always going to work, but if you're going to try a Pleco with some cichlids, the Bristlenose Pleco is probably the best one to give it a shot. I'd recommend maybe growing out the Pleco a little bit, make sure it's kind of established and, just as big, if not bigger than the cichlid you're going to be trying to home it with. But as long as you're keeping the Pleco with something that won't go after it, it's not going to go after anything, even cherry shrimp. Like I said, I've bred tons of cherry shrimp. Has a Pleco ever eaten a baby cherry shrimp? Maybe, but I've never noticed it.
Yeah, that's a good thing to mention as far as a lot of people are like, well, I want to put them in my big cichlid tank. Well, hang on a second, like you got to take some precautions at that level. I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? But the goal is, I try to mention this almost every time. My goal is to try to save time, money, and lower that stress level. And if you do things that are, best practices, I think you avoid that. I think it ends up being better in the long run for people who want to stay in the hobby and not be so frustrated by something getting killed or something, right?
I think that's a great point. I think that probably should be like one of the biggest things shared to the beginners. Here we are 3/4 of the way and 45 minutes in, but I think it's a great point because you can do a lot of things. Like if you look up on there, you look on the internet, you can find people doing anything you want. If you look hard enough, you could get validated and find someone doing what it is you want to do. And it probably is working for them. I'm not saying it's not, but in my mind, I've been doing this for a couple of years now. I still consider myself a novice, and I hope to always view it this way is I want to set myself up for as much success as possible. So is it possible to do certain things? Yes. Is it probable? Am I going to have a large chance of success? Probably not. So I try to stick to things that are not just like possible, but have a probable chance of success. And you can find and do a lot of things. And some people like to try to test those theories out, and that's cool. But I just say, understand that you're kind of on the outer thresholds testing stuff. I like to, for the most part, stick with, hey, listen, this is tried and true. This is going to work. I should have like 80-90% chance. This is all going to work. If this doesn't work out, it's kind of like a freak thing. But there's plenty of people that like to try stuff, and then you end up with a lot of Thunderdome, I like to call it sometimes. But I think it's important to realize that like a lot of things are possible, but try to stick with, in my opinion, the more probable stuff that's going to work out.
And then kind of piggyback on that, like I've been in this part of the business doing fish stuff my entire life, and I still don't know everything. I feel like I learn as much as I can every day. I learn from fish keeping, what bred better, temperatures, what people had success with. I'm still kind of thinking, okay, that looks like a good option for that specific fish or that specific situation. That might, as long as it's not outrageous, that's something I would, if I was having issues, that's what I would do. I'm not, if you're new to the hobby, if you stick to the stuff that's more tried and true, I think you'll have more success. If you get down the line and you want to test something out because it's what you're interested in, go at it, but be mindful of what's going to happen if you do, because I guarantee you, if you want to look up what's going to happen to that fish, if you introduce it to XYZ, you're going to find answers for that. At least you know what the expectation is, and try to find the best method for you that works in your favor.
I feel like there's plenty of information out there that, as aquarists, we shouldn't be surprised that often. If we get surprised by something, it should be because, like, oh my gosh, like, how did that guppy get to be 3 feet long? Like, that shouldn't have happened. Like, what the heck? Like, that would surprise me, But if I put my guppy in with my Mbuna and my guppy's not there tomorrow, like, that shouldn't surprise me. If I put my, someone actually asked to purchase, they messaged me and they wanted to buy one of my long fin albino Bristlenose Plecos I sell them at 1.5 inches, so not that big. And they wanted to put it in their Mbuna tank. And I said, well, if you're going to go with a Pleco for your African cichlid tank, Bristlenose Pleco may be the best one, but it's gonna be tough to find, but you're probably best trying to find ones like 3 or 4 inches, already grown, bigger, thicker male, whatever, and stick them in there. And don't get a long fin, because even if it was a 4-foot one with long fins,
don't do that.
That's just gonna be like Attack City, it's just gonna it's not good. That is another caveat. Long fin stuff is usually not good with things that are bitey. You're just asking for fungal infections and fin rot and all that kind of stuff.
You are asking for problems at that point. Good Lord. And then to piggyback on that, the Mbuna thing, if you're going to throw in that tank, you can't throw that even small fish like that, because that fish is going to outgrow that bushy nose as far as faster. It's going to grow faster than that fish is going to, and it's going to be super small, and there's a whole lot of issues, that's going to happen if people wanted to do that. So definitely avoid it, and just, make some good decisions, and then I guess go from there.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, I guess I'd like to close out. Final thoughts. Anything we feel like we left out, wanted to mention, anything like that?
Yeah. Let me mention this. I think we've been talking about kind of how, you guys breed the albinos on the farm, and I bred some different ones. I think it's another good point to mention that wherever you are, since Bristlenose Plecos, even though you may be watching this and listening to this, and your goal is not to breed these fish, you just want to keep them, it's actually to your benefit that they are easily bred, because that means you can probably find them locally bred to you. So we had talked about locally bred fish, and I think we mentioned it, maybe we didn't, but whenever
I don't think we did. No.
Yeah, it's nice to get, in my opinion. I try to buy from other hobbyists, or if you can find someone with similar water, that's always nice to buy from your local fish store, especially if they're breeding on site, because it's gonna not have to adjust so much. So whether you're local to Dan and can go get his that he bred on his farm, or if you're in Wisconsin and luckily someone down the street breeds them and sells them to the local fish store, you have a better chance of getting some locally bred Bristlenose Plecos that are already adapted to your water. So I think that's another benefit to these fish as well.
That's a great point. And I talk about this in a few other places, but you think about it, when we bred them, or when we breed them, we're breeding them in harder water. If you were to want these exact fish in like Portland, Oregon, I went to Portland a few years back, and their water is so soft. It is delicious for drinking. It's one of the best water I've had, like that. But that water is going to be drastically different than what these fish are in. And the acclimation process is going to be challenging. I think long term. I think short term, I don't think you'd see a whole lot of issues, but long term, you could see some issues with that fish if it can't adapt well over time. So definitely, if you can find the fish locally, it's in the same type of water. Those are super great points to point out for that. And there's all sorts of groups, Facebook groups, your aquarium society groups. There's there's band groups. There's because you can't really advertise on Facebook for fish anymore. So Offer Up, I don't know if they have fish or not. Actually, to be
honest,
honest,
you're not allowed. People get away with it some ways, but there's not a lot of fish in there because you're not supposed to. So people can kind of get around it some ways, but there's not a lot of fish being sold that I've seen on Offer Up.
Well, all right. Well, awesome, man. I think that's going to do it. That puts us at a good amount of time. Yeah, man, I just appreciate you coming on. I had a great time talking about Bristlenose Plecos. Hope we can do this again in the future. And that's it. Thank you so much. And everybody else, thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Tune in next week. We'll have another podcast coming out the next Sunday after that, too. Trying to put one out every Sunday. So that's the plan. All right.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, man. All right. Take care, everyone.